Liam, thanks for joining me here to talk about experimentation. This series in particular is interested, I am interested in how experimentation is structured and within an organization, dependent on how that organization works and how it functions. And then especially along the lines of how experimentation grows, because I think how and where experimentation lives depends on the organization, what their importance is, and um, or what the importance of where data is important, so to speak, and things like that. So, give me your viewpoint, and maybe just context for in your experience in companies that you work for in the past, where experimentation sort of lived and maybe where it grew, if you've got stories there. Just a real highlight, the 30,000 foot view from your standpoint.
Sure. So I've kind of worked quite actively in experimentation at two companies, Booking and Meta. So I'll go through those one by one. So Meta, I wasn't actually on the experimentation team, so I didn't have good visibility on how it all fit together. But my impression was that um, there were essentially each major, I guess, pillar of the business had its own experimentation kind of team in the sense that there would be an advertising experimentation people, who I spoke to a lot. Um, and I think the reason for that is obviously that different areas of the business has such different needs. Um, I think maybe a more interesting case to go into is the booking case, because there I actually got to see how it developed and evolved as booking grew. And
Mm.
also because I was in experimentation itself. I was on the experimentation team at Booking, so I got to see and I knew how it all fit together properly.
Re- Real quick though, before I'm gonna jump in there, so before we
Yeah,
go over to
sure.
booking and that story on Meta, just to clarify, because that structure that you alluded to sounds interesting, where in the advertising team you might have a bunch of, let's say product owners or channel owners, let's say, but then apart from them, you had a separate experimentation team
Oh, yeah,
for those. Is that right?
yeah, for sure. I mean, essentially, the experimentation infrastructure for advertising where I was just so complex, and you know, I mean, there were, I mean, just some of the kinds of functions they did was like for example, if you wanted to claim your impact from a launch, you had to run an experiment. Okay, what they call it, a back test. So essentially, the experiment would be launched 100%, then you'd hold it back from 5%. And
Yep.
then you would have to kind of submit the design of this experiment and your readings, and they would have to approve it. So that's one of the kinds of functions they served. The other functions they served was like um, they were quite careful with interactions in some cases. So they couldn't just run all the experiments willy nilly. Um, and so you had to book slots. So for example, they were managing the slots on who can run experiments, helping people arrange those slots. Um, that's another function. And yeah, and just coming up with innovations in the experimentation space, just kind of because the limitation on slots was a big issue. So, like, could they come up with different techniques to kind of reduce the number of slots required? So, for sure, yeah,
Yeah.
experimentation. I mean, advertising had its own experimentation team, and it's not something you could expect the individual product teams to manage themselves. It was just too complex.
And just to double click on that, and you can go over to booking now as well. But you
Sure.
mentioned like if you wanted to claim credit, I think you
hmm
used the word credit. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah,
You had to
essentially.
submit a study design.
Mm.
Can you? I'm as an aside, you can go in there now, or you can tell the story about like the experimentation trajectory or story arc of booking. But I'm especially interested in incentives, and so right there you
Yes,
kind of hit upon like one incentive. Like
exactly.
if you want to claim credit, do you have to? Did they have to? How did that work at booking and Meta? So anyway,
Um,
you can. I hate to cut you
yeah,
off on
look,
your story about booking, but
I mean, we can get. I think that is a super interesting topic. Maybe let me finish a piece on booking, then I'll tell you about the
yeah, yeah,
incentives.
yeah,
'Cause
of
I think
course.
the two tie together. Um, at booking, um, the way it worked was that when I joined, I was in an experimentation team because booking, you have the customers who book hotels, then you have the hotel. You have the platform where the hotel owners upload their rooms and availability. So and then you have customer service as well. So each of those, originally customer facing, partner facing, customer service facing, had their own experimentation teams. And that was similar to the meta case. Each of those areas had very specific needs and requirements. For example, in the hotel facing experimentation where I was, you're dealing with, you can compare a Hilton to like a huge hotel chain to like someone that just rents out their hotel room. I mean their house on weekends when they go away or something. It's like the variance is huge, right? So for example, it's crazy underpowered. Well, most things are crazy underpowered on the hotel facing experimentation side. So those are problems. But anyway, so we each had their own experimentation teams. And then what we realized is that essentially Booking was scaling into more services. So they wanted to offer flights, they wanted to offer car rentals. And then and more than that. And we just saw the future that, okay, we can't have an experimentation team for flights and an experimentation team for car rentals. If every time there's a new product offering, we have to spin up a new experimentation team, that's just not scalable. So I was in the process at Booking where essentially all those separate experimentation teams centralized into one experimentation department. And that's what we did. And I think the challenge there is how do you keep, because whilst it's really useful and scalable to be centralized and all the experimentation teams can collaborate, the other challenge is you kind of lose that, you lose touch with your customers a little bit. You're sitting in your ivory tower. So then we thought about things like, okay, ambassador programs to make sure we have experimentation representatives embedded in the various product areas and kind of meet with them regularly to stay in touch with their challenges and things like that.
Yeah, so that's interesting to mirror that a little bit, to reflect that you had a decentralized kind of pod, units of experimentation. You centralized, and then you went into a bit of a center of excellence kind of thing. And I'm curious on. Might need to interview somebody that's there now and seeing if they're making moves to. If you talk to Spotify and Uber, and I imagine around, I don't know about Meta, but maybe you can go there now. Eventually the center of excellence dissolves and those teams are just always testing. They're just relying on the fruits of the labor of all of that center of excellence work that happened, all of the standardization that happened. They're leaning back onto all of that. And so I don't know if you have any commentary on that, or we can go back to incentives.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I follow that point. I mean, maybe you could try, because why are you saying the center of excellence teams dissolve?
So if you talk to Spotify, Uber, they once had center of excellences, Disney, Hulu, but then it dissolved because the practice became so embedded and entrenched that you had those pods with effectively an experimentation ambassador or whatever embedded. So they didn't need to rely on that central team and unit anymore. The operations functions that they were helping facilitate were so systematized, so to speak, I guess. They don't use the term center of excellence. There was no controller unit of experimentation.
Well, I mean, look, do you say control? Look, we didn't, at least at Booking, we didn't control, in the sense we weren't very prescriptive about what you can run, what you can't run, what can go live, what can't. But I do think there's value in looking at the overall picture and saying, okay, this is what the data infrastructure needs to look like. These are how we need to develop it this is the kind of thing I worked at. Like, okay, we're seeing the kind of statistical methods that various people need. How can we kind of do that in a scalable way to then scale it across the entire organization? So I do think there's a need for that centralized control in the sense of all of the pieces that are required for experimentation. But for sure,
I think maybe analogous to where you were like, oh, we can't spin up an experimentation team for every new product. It's similar to centers of excellence. You can't create a center of excellence for every function. So design center of excellence, data center of excellence, experimentation center. So at some point you have to just put that into your operational model for how the company works and does its work. And then there's SOPs that support, or whatever that supports that type of stuff. I don't know. Talking with Luke Frank over at Spotify, like they don't have like that centralized unit. Dan Layfield at Uber, they just test. I mean, there's no center of excellence or talking about that or central control unit. Every product owner just tests, and it's just part of the DNA.
But who owns all the infrastructure around experimentation?
I think the broader organization, so they're using custom tools that were standardized as part of, like I mentioned, the now extinct center of excellence.
So everyone just kind of co-owns it in.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah. So
I mean, if it can work like that, because I think that is. Look, I'll say one other thing. I mean, there's a downside to the center of excellence, which I saw, which is that if now one team is responsible for making all the improvements, suddenly it's very easy for that team to suddenly become the blockers, because
that's
all
the
the various teams need
centralized.
different things.
That's the downfall for centralization. Yeah,
exactly.
And you can get like domain side excellence, like functional excellence, but you sacrifice agility in doing that. Yeah. So let's talk about incentives, because I know we talked about this before, and this is where I'm fascinated about, like you mentioned before, around some product owners, claiming credit, and we have previous conversation about, okay, you're a product owner, you run for a quarter, and after the end of the quarter, you look at all your tests that you run, and like, let's do a holdout group, or let's do something, and then only that then kind of helps self-align the quality control side of things, where you don't have to have anybody sitting on top of them on like the quality of the experiment and the study design. And talk to me about this.
Okay, so the way it worked at Meta is that to essentially, for a team would have a goal to achieve X revenue in a quarter, and then to count any progress towards that goal, they would have to run a back test, and then the point estimate essentially from that back test would become their what they counted towards that goal. So if they got 0.1 increase in revenue, then that's what they counted, and they would add that all up at the end of the quarter, and that was it. And I think the benefit there is that, okay, so there needs to be control at that final measurement step, when you need someone to essentially, there needs to be rigorous controls to make sure that the revenue, for example, that someone claims is properly measured. They didn't peak, they didn't run shorter than they said they would. So you do need that. But then once you make sure that you've got that in place, then essentially the teams who are interested in running high quality experiments leading up to that, in deciding whether to launch, what's a good opportunity to explore, so essentially they are saying, I want to set a target of 0.2% revenue in Q1. Before they've even set that target, they've already run 3 maybe experiments to dial in that estimate on what they think they're going to get, because they know they're going to have one shot. Because if your back test gives poor results, then sorry for you. So essentially, by putting such a stringent set of rules on how you can claim impact, the teams are suddenly very interested in getting really reliable estimates for those impacts. And what's the best way of getting reliable estimates of impact? You run good experiments.
Yeah. So let me mirror that, but in the contrast world where most of us live, which is probably less data. And also, I would say not only less data, but also the insufficient infrastructure to do those holdout tests or those back tests and stuff like that. There's a technical requirement in order to be able to do that. Like, let's say on a quarterly basis, there are some cool tools out there that do allow you to like do holdout groups across a bunch of different campaigns, and you can work that way. But normally this is quite rare, and normally testers that I've talked to in my experience in running programs, you're running, let's say 10 experiments or 5 experiments in a quarter. Each experiment, might have, 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks of data within it, and then you
Mhm.
calculate a statistic of that financial model. You calculate the statistic of financial impact during, roughly that time period in which the test ran, because you don't want to do a model on top of a model and extrapolate too far out. You're like, okay, at a monthly basis, this is ROI. And then after a quarter, I ran 10 tests and my monthly ROI stacked up to X amount. But the problem with that, to mirror kind of what you said, is that unless you have a way to sort of hold accountable quality of tests, I could be peaking, I could be stopping early,
Sure.
I could be just playing the system to my favor, because if I'm only managed on that metric uplift, that financial uplift, and I'm not held accountable on some kind of study design component, then what's my incentive, right?
Exactly.
So I wonder how we do that. Like in absence of the data and infrastructure requirements needed to do that holdout stuff, you
But
just have to test by test. You've got to be really rigorous.
but
So
but but a, but a back. I mean, to do a back test, okay, a holdout is probably a bit more complicated. But to do a back test, I mean, if you can run the test, I don't think forward test is a word, but let's imagine forward test is a word. If you can just run your standard A/B test, where in control you haven't got your change, test you got your change, it's easy to do a back test. I mean, you've essentially already got the code there. You just
yeah, but we're talking about 10 tests, and some of the tests might have built on top of each other, and um,
oh
yeah. So
yeah.
that's what I'm saying. Like across a quarter, not a single test, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. No, I hear you. And I think that is a complication. It's that sometimes essentially you would need to implement one test which essentially incorporates all those changes, which
Yeah,
can
that
then get complicated.
that's a little bit weird. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And also from the technical side of things, like some tests might just not run together in a way. I don't know. I can't think of a scenario at the moment, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, the thing we tried at booking, and to be honest, I had left by the time it kind of got going, so I don't know if it yielded fruit. But we tried to implement quality metrics. So so we were looking at things like, just all the standard things you should do when running an experiment, and we reported them at the team department level, and we tried to get senior leadership buy-in, even to score their teams on them. So I think that's another way to align incentives. I just think it's a lot harder, and there's probably going to be loopholes.
mm,
If you're not monitoring something, then you know.
yeah, awesome. I want to ask you a last question before I wrap up. I try to keep these concise. And being at Booking and Meta, you've come from a world in which people just test. I mean, you just mentioned buy-in, and
Mhm.
Um, I'm curious about your perspectives on BIOM, and maybe you don't have any because there are organizations that exist where testing and proving out outcomes of what people ship is not done.
Mhm.
And this is actually more common than not.
Mhm.
This is where project managers are actually more product managers are actually more project managers, and they're really shipping rewarded and pat on the back for their output. I
Mhm.
shipped a project, I shipped this
Sure.
big strategic project, I did this, and but they're not proving it out, they're not measuring it, doing interventions with regards to kind of like smaller MVP versions of shipping that and
Mhm.
directing how something gets implemented. um, this interview series, I'm finding that there's a big sort of schism. Like there's project organizations that work that way, and then there's true product organizations. I think Meta, Booking
Mhm.
fall into that category. Apple, Microsoft, these they're running product operating model and
Mhm.
kind of living and breathing like empowered product teams per Marty Kagan and things like that. But I'm
Mhm.
I'm curious on your perspective on the other side of that. And do you have one? Maybe you don't. But from you live in a product operating model world, the last two organizations that you were at,
Yeah.
how do you carve out time for a product manager that's really just shipping and not testing, and how are they getting buy-in and from leadership? Yeah.
You mean, how are you trying to get people to move to the product model? Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I've been fortunate enough to be at very product-driven organizations. But I don't know. I would think, and this is purely theoretical, but if you take, I would imagine that taking something that you really believe in, just getting one test where you can show that, hey, this idea you had, it's actually a bad idea. Like,
Mm,
I mean, essentially, I guess you need the counterfactual. If we hadn't done this, we would have, you would have launched this, and now I'm showing you otherwise. Because essentially, if you get a test which validates your opinion, then that's not really transformative, is it? Right? So I
yeah.
would expect you need something like that. But does it work in practice? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Uh,
I guess it's not that simple.
I love you bringing up counterfactuals though, so that's good. All right, thanks, Liam. I appreciate it, man. This
Cool.
great interview, 20 minutes. We're good to stop here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.